So welcome everyone. We're very pleased today to have Steve Pette with us, who was involved in setting up one of the early and very successful workspaces in central London and is very much abreast of the trends now as an advisor in the workspace. So Steve, as you know, under the guise of the South London Big Initiative, you are launching both programs that link university expertise and our area businesses, and are also behind funding the physical delivery of workspace projects. So I'd love to talk with you about the latter.
Great. Hello.
Yeah, some people who aren't familiar with Workspace might think they're kind of one size fits all. Can you tell us a little bit about the range of types of workspace and who they cater to?
Yeah, I think it depends who your target market is. And, clearly, as we all know, you've got everything that moves from sort of high end, like for a space with 25-year-old balsamic vinegars sitting in the kitchen with cookies and high fit out, high specification, all the way down to sort of more earthy, sort of salt of the earth operations that are catering to digital and tech. It really depends on who your audience is, whether or not they're early stage or whether or not they're corporate or whether or not large enterprise businesses that are moving in.
Yes. So I guess along with those different models comes a degree of ranges of commerciality. So some are very highly commercial and kind of very much a profit model, and others, and I'm thinking things like Makerspace, some of the creative units, can be subsidized. Is that what you've found?
Yeah, and I think it's a question of who's subsidizing or how they are underpinned, whether or not they're underpinned on a management model, or whether or not they're underpinned by public sector. I suppose my view would always be that it always needs to wash its face. You can sort of throw some money into it, but where are you deriving the value? And it should at least be covering its cost. It shouldn't be a burden onto either the councils or the taxpayers. It should be adding value in lots of different ways, but it can still be affordable and it can still be inclusive.
Great. So that kind of gets us to the point where we're talking a little bit about those public sector providers. Do you have advice to them when they're considering these trade-offs? There's sometimes financial trade-offs. Oftentimes operators will require things like lower rents or rent-free periods. What should public sector providers be thinking about when they're setting out the objectives for what they want to get from their workspace?
I think the part that comes through quite strongly at the minute is inclusive growth, affordability, and social value, and how all of that feeds into the bigger economy, as well as the usual GVA and job growth. But there is a balance to it all. It's not just about putting somebody in who is going to provide the highest level of commerciality. I think it depends how you want it to be structured and ultimately what your outcomes are as a local authority. I know it to be true that these environments create jobs. I also know that it provides a focus for people to come together and coalesce. And it can also reactivate areas and it can regenerate areas. Because there is that sort of focus and it's a gathering of like minds.
So sometimes those types of objectives and outputs from these projects can be kind of the longer term ones. They're about restructuring economies, regeneration. And we all know those are kind of longer term things. And sometimes I know councils get a lot of pressure from, the property side, for instance, to make it a very commercial let. So those are kind of, seems to me, some of the trade-offs that people face in trying to come up with their model for how their workspace is going to work.
And I think that's really true. There are some local authorities who, in fact, all of the regeneration teams that I have met get it. They get the fact that there needs to be job growth. They get the fact that there needs to be sort of economic activity. A number of times the difficulty comes in with the property teams when they have to overlay their thinking. They apply a linear thought that was probably true maybe 5 or 10 years ago, but isn't necessarily true now. And it's even less true post-corona.
Yeah.
This is not about long-term let. It's not about asking for pre-lets. It's covenants. Yes, I understand it. It's important, but I suppose it's how it works and how it's structured. There's a real sort of challenge and balance to all of this. Yes, it needs to wash its face, but it's not just about pumping it for as much as you can get. I think you need to be activating it in the right ways. And that means that everybody needs to take a balanced view, and that
Yeah.
includes the property teams.
Yeah, I have some sympathy there because I know councils are under so much financial pressure that
Yep.
it is tempting to be thinking that way. But you're right. These projects require a bit of checks and balances and figuring out what your priorities are kind of from the onset and getting everybody on board. Strikes me that's a kind of a good strategy to take.
Yeah, and it has to be that balanced approach. And in fairness, I think property teams do get it. There is an expectation and outcomes from them of optimizing assets. But you've also got to look at the bigger picture, and especially where we are today.
Yeah, fair enough. Good. So I just wanted to flip over to the operators because some of the aims we talked out were kind of about the types of tenants we might have and inclusiveness, et cetera. But fundamentally, between those aims are an operator who's typically hired on in various different ways. Can you talk a little bit about the various roles you see, but of the types of operators, what role they play and what role the landlord plays? In this case, it would be the public sector, and who pays for what, who's responsible for what, who gets the profits, kind of like how do you share up the responsibility, the risks, and all the returns between those parties?
It really comes down to your appetite and risk levels and what you're actually putting forward for the local authorities. If they're putting in enablement funds, local authorities love capex because it's an easy way of allocating money because it's accepted. Part of the challenge that I've always had with a number of local authorities is that there is money available for capex to make something look wonderful and shine brightly. But then when it comes to content and programming, there's no money for the content and programming because everything's gone in on the capex.
That's
And
the revenue funding that, the capital versus revenue funding, and everybody in the public sector side will always say it's the revenue funding that's the hard piece to get.
yeah, but you've also got to activate programs. You've also got to activate content. It's like building a beautiful hotel that's absolutely gorgeous and then having sort of people in it and a service level that actually doesn't work. Doesn't matter how beautiful it is. If the service is rubbish, people won't go back. The same applies to workspaces and co-worker spaces. There is a similarity between the two things. And that is part of the challenge. How it can be done, who takes the risk. When councils do the capex and fit out, there is a process that is followed, which I understand and which I understand the reasoning. I think if you are looking for best value, then contributions to tenants is definitely probably a better way because you will end up with better value that
Can you
comes from
explain
it.
that a little bit, Steve? The contribution to tenants, what does that translate to?
So if the landlord gives a contribution of a sum of money to the tenants for the fit out and capex works, then they will generally derive better value giving it to them than they would actually procuring and going through the procurement process themselves.
I see. So essentially, leaving some of that kind of getting to shell and core and leaving some of that detailing that's going to be tied to the operator's model a little bit more to them.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's a blended approach, really. I know that I can do it quicker, faster, better, and probably cheaper than a larger organization. And you only need to look around. Large enterprise businesses can spend fortunes, but I could probably achieve something that was similar in look and feel for potentially half the money.
Okay.
It
And
just who you go to.
so so that's kind of a way to get some of that fit out done. Do operators typically expect they might be expecting some help with that fit out, but are they expecting some kind of coverage of their upfront risks, which can often translate to kind of getting periods of not paying market rents or not paying rents at all, rent-free periods? And how does that translate in this day and age, and what kind of leases could you expect them wanting to take on? Because it's all a little bit changed these days, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think in terms of is there rent-free period? I think anybody would expect rent-free periods, to be honest, if they could. It all will come down to what level of contribution is being made, who's doing the base fit outs or enablement works. Inherently, 2 years ago, it was the operator who was taking it on as sort of shell and core and having to do all of the fit out.
Okay.
If this is a joint project and the local authority is paying all of that money up front for all of that work, then I think it's fair to say, you were on a rent period, and that rent period could ratchet over the course of the first 6 months up to an acceptable level because they're not having to put all of that in. But then there are other businesses where the local authority is putting all of the money in, and then it's working on a profit share or a profit split as and when, because there is a long-term view on this. It really comes down to the individual authorities as to their level of risks, how they want this to work, whether or not it's a straight lease, whether or not it's a blended approach, whether or not there are waterfall structures on profit and super profit, and it almost becomes a management agreement. The risk really should come down to more so to the operator, because it's up to them to make this work in conjunction with the authorities, but fundamentally they're the specialists.
Yeah, there's a little bit of things like if you get everything for free, your incentive's down a little bit, isn't it? So having some skin in the game, as they often say, is really important when you're bringing on an operator, and trying to figure out how that plays out is going to be important. Although they're going to be a little bit more risk averse, I imagine, in this day and age. So.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it will come back and it will get better and it will improve, but certainly, there are a number of local authorities who are activating, using monies to be able to do this, and then going on a profit share or a management agreement with operators as they go in.
Yeah, so they retain some of the upside at the end of the day.
The operators are looking, they need to safeguard their own brand, and they need to deliver and execute on what it is that they do. And that just comes down to you understanding that they've got experience and they're actually going to be sort of, a really good thing to have.
Yeah. So I think that nicely morphs into the next question, which is we're outer London boroughs, and location's a big thing when we talk about anything to do with property. And does the location, and maybe adding in the component of size of these units, have a bearing on what type of operator you might attract? And do you think about kind of an ideal or minimum size that makes these things viable? Is there some kind of rule of thumb with that?
Yeah, the viability is really over 6,000 square feet.
Okay.
If you're in outlying areas, you might pick up a space that's maybe 10,000 square feet. There is more money to be made on the larger floor plates, but whether or not you will find that in some of the outlying areas, that's open.
Yeah.
But there is a tipping point that you can access. And ultimately, the other part of this is that you are bringing people in for people to grow to then ultimately spin out. But you also want to have the size and space for those businesses to move to sort of 10 or 15. It might not be many, but it's like 10 or 15.
Yeah. So that kind of brings us nicely to the tenants and kind of what we're offering them, because that's really the focus of all of this. And when you're thinking of, when you're either an operator or a landlord, in this case the public sector, you're thinking about how to attract these tenants, and you might be considering how you know, what size you need of space, which we've already talked about, but what the configuration is of that space, what gets offered within that space, what kind of amenities. Are there programs provided, mentorships that kind of bring together the different businesses? Can you talk a little bit about those types of considerations?
Yeah, you need all of those. There is no one size fits all. Um, the rise over the course of the last 5 years of co-working workspaces and larger players coming into the market like WeWork and VC-backed businesses and large property companies like British Land, who have the funding and the monies to be able to throw at these things. And generally, they throw a lot of money into these co-working spaces, not necessarily for the co-working space, but because they want the uplift to the other floor plates, and some of these are ran at a loss, and it's a loss leader. But that has set a level of expectation. And for smaller operators who are more independent, who do not have that sort of level of funding, you've got to work really hard to try and achieve something because the expectation levels are there. And there is only a certain amount of money that can probably be charged for space in outlying regional areas.
Mm.
There is a maximum limit. London can run at £1,000 per person per desk, dependent on what you offer, but you are offering a 5-star hotel service for that.
Yeah.
Whereas you're probably looking at more 3 or 4-star on the regional side.
Mm.
That doesn't mean there is any less love, heart, and soul. And I think that's the other part that's important. When things are done with the right intent in order to create that community, that's what people value. And people love to be known and love to be acknowledged.
Yeah. So there's
That's
that last part speaks to a little bit of a curation of the space, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think, it's it needs to be good. It needs to look good and feel good because you're basing your business there. And as soon as somebody walks through that door, they will identify with what they see, and that speaks about their business and it speaks about them.
Yeah.
So the bar has definitely been set quite high. Spit and sawdust stuff doesn't really work anymore. If you're doing something, it needs to look good, feel good, and then it needs to be backed up by the right people.
Yeah. So there's a degree of, with the operator, you're looking for a degree of real ownership and passion for the space that you're asking them to operate.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. Okay.
And that heart and soul, that's the magic sauce. That's what's going to make the difference. Anybody can put somebody in with a strong covenant who's guaranteed a level of rent, and then we'll try and rinse the space, but that will not create the community or the outcomes that people are now looking for in terms of social impact and general feel-good factors.
Yeah. So, and I think that brings us to kind of those bigger aims, because we're not looking just for workspaces these days to just help companies deliver jobs. We're looking to do that in an inclusive way. We're looking for diversity in our tenant base, supporting, BAME industries, et cetera. So that's all very much at the core. And those are things that need to be kind of done explicitly rather than just kind of leaving it to happenstance.
Yeah, it needs to be curated.
Yeah.
What you will find is that dependent on the membership types that you have, those people by default are passionate themselves. They will generally 99.9% of the time be interested in creating the right environment, and they are key to the programming. They're key to events. They are key to talking about this business as almost their business, and they will help to define the success of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I just wanted to follow up with one more question. That's a little bit about how do you, the extent to which individual sites can become a system? And we're particularly thinking about launching kind of 7 of these locations across South London. And there's also another component, which is we're looking to involve the universities in these, if not from the get-go, but we're looking to have them involved. Can you talk about examples where you've seen both the multiple sites and the system work? And I know something like WeWork, that's essentially core to their model, but maybe slightly different.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about maybe the university collaboration, if you've ever seen that work somewhere.
Yeah. So the system perspective, it is really interesting. So when we first started out in 2010, apart from trying to educate people on what this was, there was an ability for people to be able to move around. Truth is that only 3 or 4% of your membership will actually go somewhere else.
Yeah.
In terms of actually walking it. Slightly different in central London, but certainly outlying areas, only maybe 3 or 4%. It's not about the fact that they go and use, it's about the fact that they can.
Yeah.
And that they have that ability. When you don't have it, it works against you. So the stronger the network, the better it is. So in terms of these 7, all 7 should have an agreement that people who are members of theirs can also go and use somewhere else. But it needs to be done by prior arrangement. They can't just walk up. And there's lots of ways to cut it, and there's lots of ways to sell it. But it's the fact that people can go and do it if they so desire. I think what has come from the last 18 months is that people recognize the strength of community.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the sort of nirvana was always members, universities, talent, and sort of space with funding. And that ability to be able to integrate the two things in a coherent way and in the right way makes a big difference and can make a big difference.
Yeah, I think I've got a background in the States, and I think that universities have traditionally been involved a little bit more with their local economies, just as a general statement. And it's not true everywhere, but I think, and I've heard comments that it's kind of going more that direction here. And I think there's certainly a big push by central government to get the knowledge exchange component much more active and getting the value out of universities into local businesses. So you're right, thinking about that up front, having that as a key component, as part of the big thought about what we're trying to do, I think is a very important differentiator in this instance.
Yeah, because it needs to be baked in at the beginning, which is clearly, the knowledge exchange partnership. That is what it's about.
Yeah, exactly.
And creating those links, creating those opportunities, because the businesses that spin out, and let's face it, there's a lot of universities that are running entrepreneurial courses. And we're not going to get into whether or not you can be taught to be an entrepreneur or whether you are an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But the fact is that, these people need to be around like-minded people, and smaller organizations, smaller businesses are looking for good talent. There's a lot of people out there, but there's not a lot of good people out there.
Yeah. Exactly.
So everybody benefits. It's quite, it's symbiotic.
Yeah. So, Steve, thank you so much. I don't know, any last parting shots?
As parting shots is, this sets a tone. What you do sets a tone, sets a voice. Don't try and overcomplicate it, and don't try and tell the people who do it on a daily basis what they need to do and how they need to do it. Give them outcomes and give them targets, and make sure that those targets are relevant. But ultimately, it's down to them to make the magic happen.
Yeah, fair enough. Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Much appreciate your time. Some good thoughts about Workspace, and I think we drew on a good a good chunk of your experience in actually getting these things going and operating some. So thanks again.